Hello, welcome back to the channel. In this episode we will be continuing our tour of the tarot, and the next card is the Magician. So this card is number 1 as the Fool was 0. What does this card tell us about the journey?
Well, I'm looking at the Rider-Waite card, as we will be throughout the series, partly because it's the most widely used, I think, at the moment, and partly because I find it the most symbolically rich, although that's not to downplay any of the other cards. It is numbered 1. We know that the history of the tarot suggests the numbers weren't necessarily always there at the beginning and so on, but for the purposes of today, it is numbered 1 in the suite of the major arcana, so that clearly seemed significant. But nevertheless, it comes after the Fool, so it's not the first card, even though it's labelled as number 1. And we've talked about the Fool as being both part of and not part of this set of major arcana. I was surprised when I first learned that this was the first card. Why would the Magician come first?
Yeah, because it seems quite high class.
Seems quite highly classed and esoteric, difficult. It's not an ordinary way into things, but then again, are any of them an ordinary way into things? So one of the questions could be, why would this be the first card? And I think that's kind of what you're asking there. One way, I suppose, to answer that is to say, well, the Magician, apart from anything else, seems to be resourced, seems to be equipped. And he's equipped with all 4 suits available to him represented on the table in front of him. So you've got Pentacle, Cup, Sword and Wand, which represent all 4 of the suits, or suits of cards. And if this is the first step of a journey, it would make sense then to have available all of those different suits for that journey. So I think that's at least one sense in which the Magician could come first. I think there is a more meta answer to the question, which is less to do with the Magician in the picture and more to do with the tarot as a whole, which repeats, I think, a little bit the notion of the Fool himself representing us as our avatar. The Fool is who we are as we go on the journey. Similarly, I think the Magician is the tarot reader in some way, because these are cards. We associate cards with magic, magic tricks, the ability to divine, predict, see things that aren't necessarily available to everybody else. And in that sense, the Magician represents a meta position, the tarot reader per se. And then the question is, rather as with the Fool, are we going to assume that role for ourselves and be able to interpret these cards for ourselves, or do we ask an expert, a magician, the tarot reader, to read them for us? So the Magician is both the magician and the tarot reader, I think, in this deck. And that tarot reader could either be ourselves or an expert of some kind. So I think there is a complex layer there, I suppose, of what's going on in the Magician. It's not any old card in that regard.
And also, I think the tarot can get a bad rap for, when you say tarot reader, it conjures images of fortune tellers and telling fortunes and that kind of thing. But actually, if you're able to read yourself, it's quite it's an act of self-knowledge.
I agree, and conjure is the word. I think that's important because there's the potential for mystification, abuse, misleading people that comes with setting yourself up as a tarot reader, and the idea that you have access to truths that other people don't, because you're especially endowed with a gift to be able to read those truths. And so I think it is open to that kind of abuse. But if we bear in mind this other possibility that the Magician is ourselves and the expertise can lie within us for self-knowledge, as you're saying, then we're perhaps less likely to commit ourselves to the good or ill intent of a tarot reader who may or may not be blessed with otherworldly powers.
Yeah. And the fact that he's got all the suits on the table tells us that we have that knowledge ourselves. It's not the tarot reader that has that knowledge, it's you have that knowledge.
Yeah, or not, you know, I
Yeah.
mean, we just don't know. But the tarot as a whole seems to be suggesting there are layers and levels of knowledge which we're invited to pursue, and that those layers or levels of knowledge are ones which wouldn't necessarily be accessed through more orthodox means, through science, experiment, observation, deduction, and so on. That there are levels of knowledge to be accessed through symbols, intuition, history, perhaps tradition, and so on. So the magician also is signifying that too, that we're entering into an alternative source or realm of knowledge.
Yeah.
There is an overlap, which of a pretty clear overlap here between the world of the magician and the world of religion.
Yeah.
It's hard for me to look at this card and not think of the priest standing behind the altar table, partly because the accoutrements he has on the table are evocative, and especially in the cup, of the chalice.
Yeah.
And the furniture, as it were, of the communion. And it's impossible for me to see this card without being reminded of that. Now, anybody who's studied religion and magic, I mean, the most famous book that I've read on the subject is Religion and the Decline of Magic by Keith Thomas, written by a member of the same college that I've been part of, where the history of civilization really is the history of the overcoming of magic by religion and the subsequent overcoming of religion by reason. And that is the three-step process, I suppose, that we're supposed to go through in terms of culture. So even consulting a card like this, the magician, might be seen to be not just a retrograde step, but a counter-enlightenment, counter-rational step, because we're going back away from reason, A, towards religion, and B, towards the magic, and indeed the superstition which precedes religion.
Yeah.
So it could be seen to be a return to much less evolved scientific and pre-enlightenment ways of thinking, which is one of the reasons I'm sure that tarot is held in such low regard by so many people insofar as it's thought of at all, because it's seen as superstitious mumbo jumbo and a backward step from all the gains of enlightenment and science back through religion to this mystifying past, which seems to benefit only those people who appoint themselves as magicians and inheritors of some sacred truth.
Which is interesting because, of course, tarot started out as a game. It's just a card deck game, which came from China and then went from North Africa down to Germany and France and Italy.
Yeah.
So its roots is not esoteric at all.
Yeah, although I understand there's also some debate about that even from quite early on, the cards were used for divination and cartomantic purposes, but we don't want to get too much into the history of that because there's all sorts of different accounts.
Yeah, so the Rider-Waite-Smith deck is based on the original card game. I have a deck based on the original from Italy back in 1300s, and it's quite interesting that the magician is more of a street trickster, street magician. He has a table the same as this one, and it's got a knife and a pen, and it seems more of a lowly figure rather than
A priestly figure.
a priestly figure.
Yeah.
So it's quite interesting, the development of these images.
Yeah, and even with the one I'm looking at, the Rider-Waite deck, there's a little bit of a sense that he could use these artifacts on the table to conduct a series of magic tricks just for the sake of illusion and entertainment and so on. There are things which obviously point in the other direction. So we have the figure of the alluded to figure of the priest here behind the table conducting a ritual. We have a somewhat Christ-like appearance of the priest in this figure, partly because the symbol above his head is a bit like a halo. It's a symbol of infinity, a figure of eight, but it's a bit like a halo. Possible allusion to the crown of thorns there as well. So we do have Jesus-like imagery and with the cloak and so on. So there is that going on too. I'm interested also in the different positions his arms are pointing in. Now, my background is in philosophy, so I can't help thinking of perhaps the most famous painting related to philosophy, which is called the School of Athens, that depicts both Plato and Aristotle.
Oh yeah.
In that picture, you've got Aristotle pointing at the ground and Plato pointing to the heavens. The idea being that Aristotle was more occupied with the physical realm and Plato with the metaphysical realm. Of course, it's more complicated than that, and there are overlaps and differences between the two. But this figure seems to be doing both, and in my mind, there is a evocation of that famous painting. But what's different about the magician then is that he has both axes going on at the same time, downwards and upwards, and those are separated out in the philosophical tradition between Plato and Aristotle. So this figure seems to be saying that these two worlds can be or ought to be united by the man, the heavenly and the earthly, and brought together as one and integrated in some way.
Yeah.
So he is a figure of integration, not just of the artifacts on the table. He brings them all together, but he brings the upper and the lower world together too. The other, in that sense, he's kind of a Renaissance man. And the other allusion in this, to me, is to Vitruvian Man, the famous picture of Vitruvius with his arms outspread.
Yeah.
With the human being at the center of the world in the kind of what's supposed to be, I think it's highly contestable, this, the Renaissance idea, as if there's just one, of this integrated human at the center of the universe who unites all the elements and is the measure of all things. So the famous Renaissance phrase, man is the measure of all things. So I think there's a bit of that going on too. Although I think in this figure, the heavenly realm is slightly more privileged than the earthly realm here, even though we have the abundant flowers at his feet. Feels to me the tenor of this card points more towards the transcendental than the terrestrial, to the heavenly than the earthly. It seems that is the bias. It feels to me, and I could be wrong, there is a slight bias towards that here, towards the more mystical, and maybe because his right hand is the one that's holding the other artifact, I suppose. The second thing I'd say is that this picture is framed. We have the writing, the magician, at the bottom, but it's framed within the frame, like a vignette in a 19th century preface. We have a vignette, almost literally a vignette, because they're not vines, but they are flowers. A vignette being a small picture which frames as if by vines a figure at the frontispiece of a text. And this is a framing device which does, I think, add to this sense of the sacred, because it creates context or content within a structure. So we have the frame, we have the flowers, then we have the table, and then we have the priest. And then we have this glowing yellow color behind him. I think it's the same color in the Rider-Waite deck as that of the Fool in the background, which is a slightly lurid egg yolky color. And this one, it suggests a sort of infinity behind him. But either way, he is also acting as a doorman, I think, to something behind, or a gateway to something behind. Later on, we'll get to the Hierophant, who is more expressly a priestly figure, a person who serves as a way between two realms. And I don't think the magician is guarding it necessarily, but nevertheless, it does seem, and the way that his arms are acting as a diagonal across that oblong space, they are a bit of a barrier too, to something which he has access to, and we may or may not have access to. And again, the association there is with the priest, or the high priest, as Jesus, as the Christ was sometimes known. Just a word though, again, because although we have these spiritual artifacts, man-made artifacts, we do have this natural environment as well. We have the flowers. And I think it's important that nature is included as well as artifice within the world of magic, because I think evoked there the idea of plant medicine, for example, as nature providing a almost, I really hesitate to use this word because it's not one I'm comfortable with, but an almost shamanic way to generate alternative forms of consciousness through nature, through plant life and so on. And that plant life itself might be more in touch with these other forms of knowledge. Although I should say, knowledge is the thing. It seems that knowledge is the most desirable entity that we can seek after. And I think it's a bit like the Fool in that regard. It feels like these are, so far at least, cards on the journey towards a kind of knowing, and that knowledge is the key thing, rather than being, for example, or having or acquiring or whatever. That knowledge is the thing. And that's the thing that should most or does most inspire and motivate us.
Thank you very much, and please do subscribe, like, comment, and click the notification bell. And we'll see you in the next one on this journey through the tarot. Thank you.